Welcome everyone to Sermon Notes for this week. We're looking at Matthew chapter 5. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and we're looking specifically how the Sermon on the Mount connects with the Old Testament teachings of Yahweh given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And so that's where we're starting as we look in chapter 5 at verse 1. You can look with me, which says that as Jesus one day saw the crowds gathering, he went up on a mountainside. Well, right away, the Jewish audience for Matthew is connecting Jesus going up onto a mountain, especially coming out of a desert testing wilderness time, with the Old Testament when the people of Israel had been, in fact, brought out of Egypt into the wilderness. And at that time, Moses went up a mountain. Now, you remember in the Old Testament, when Moses went up a mountain, he went up Mount Sinai. So that's here in the Old Testament, Mount Sinai, and that's in Exodus, starting in chapter 19. Moses goes up to the mountain, and there in Exodus 19, and moving forward from Exodus 19 right to the end of Deuteronomy, really, but there in Exodus 19, Yahweh speaks directly to Moses and gives Moses his commandments. And these commandments are the way in which Israel is meant to govern their lives, meant to live out their lives. It is his ethical teachings, and by those teachings, the people of Israel, as they follow those, will be set apart, different than all the nations around them. And they will be a light unto the nations around them. They'll be like salt that gives flavor to the world. And the nations will see that about Israel and will be drawn to them. Well, that's the Old Testament, what we call the law. And the Old Testament law is then on the minds of the Jewish audience that's hearing Matthew now in chapter 5, here in the New Testament, when Jesus goes up a mount to teach. Well, the connection's important because there's an apologetic that's going on here in Matthew chapter 5 that Matthew is trying to bring to his audience. And I think it actually fits for today as well. The apologetic is this, that first of all, Jesus is in fact the Messiah. We see that going on right from the beginning of Matthew, even in the genealogies that he gives us in chapter 1. We see it in chapter 2. We see it in chapter 3 with the calling of the Messiah from John the Baptist. In chapter 4, when Jesus fulfills the first messianic calling to fulfill the kingdom of heaven, and he does this by coming in power. So you remember, power is the first aspect of the kingdom of heaven that the Messiah would in fact complete, and that is power over Israel's enemies. We saw that in chapter 4 when Jesus defeats the devil in the wilderness. The second way we see, and this is an apologetic, remember, don't forget that that's where we're at right now. The apologetic is that the Messiah will also be used by Yahweh to bring back God's people from exile. And that is what happens in the end of chapter 4 when Jesus is calling people. And he's calling them unto himself, and he calls them from all over. And so people are coming by responding, by following him. Well, now the third aspect we see happening here when he goes up the mountain. And that third aspect of the kingdom of heaven is place. And so God coming in power to defeat Israel's enemies, to draw his people back from exile in order to now rule over them as king, to rule over them and lead them in worship by following the law. Yeah, lead people in the correct obedience of and following through on God's commandments. And so we have to see that there is a continuity going on here between the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and the teachings in the Old Testament. Yeah, because this was always the intention, that the Messiah would be used by God in order to lead his people in the fulfillment of and following of the law. So there's continuity in this. In fact, Jesus says in verse 17 of chapter 5 that he didn't come to abolish this, but to accomplish it. And none of this is going to pass away. It's going to actually be fulfilled. How? In him. And how that is fulfilled is actually by not just completing it, as in a test that you have to complete, but by embodying this, by being this, and in fact exceeding it. Yeah, and so we see in chapter 5 that Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees. And so we have to see that this Sermon on the Mount is actually about taking this continuity piece, established a continuity between the New Testament teaching and the Old Testament teaching, and actually exceeding this. And so we're going to look a little bit now about what Jesus means when he is exceeding this teaching of the Old Testament. Well, how is this done? First of all, we see that Jesus gives a list of blessings. You remember that from last week. These blessings are called the Beatitudes. And this list of blessings is very different than the blessings that are listed at the end of Deuteronomy. Those blessings seem to be material blessings. Coming into the land, you will be blessed in these material ways. And really, that's a way that humanity is typically thinking about blessings from God. If God's going to bless me, I'll be rich. And so there's an idea of blessed if I'm rich. Well, in the New Testament, we see that this is being exceeded now with the Beatitudes right away when Jesus says, actually, you're blessed if you're poor. If we can just sort of look at that together here in chapter 5, looking at verse 3, God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Well, that's an extraordinary upside down way of thinking about the world, and it's actually a way of exceeding this righteousness of the Pharisees, which was actually only on the outward side, only an outward show and not an inward reality and truth. So the inward reality of truth of living in poverty, physical poverty, that's really going on here in verse 3, is that there is a correlating spiritual poverty that comes within that, a realization of need. And so that realization of need that's happening here can only be fulfilled in Jesus. Now, don't lose this here, but there's a connection to the apologetic that's going on. You remember, I haven't lost that train of thought. Apologetic for Matthew is to say that Jesus is in fact that Messiah. But listen, he's not just the Messiah. Matthew wants us to know that Jesus is also God himself. And this is very helpful for us today when we might be having a conversation with someone about, is Jesus just a good person, or was he in fact God? And you may even be wondering to yourself, I think that Jesus is God, but sometimes I wonder if he is. This is so helpful for us to be able to walk through then the gospel and see that Matthew wants us to not miss that. He is trying to make it as clear as he possibly can. How? When Moses went up to Mount Sinai, you remember that he received that direct teaching from Yahweh himself. And then Yahweh's teaching, inscribed by Yahweh's finger on the stones, were brought down to the people so that they could follow God's commandments. Well, it's very different here in the New Testament. And the apologetic that's given is that when Jesus goes up to the mountainside, he teaches the people himself. He teaches the people how to live the law and to actually exceed the law. When he says, you've heard it said this way, but I tell you this way, what authority he has. He's speaking as though he's God from the Old Testament. He's speaking as though he's Yahweh talking to Moses, inscribing these things on stone. Now, I'm trying to be a bit dramatic there to make the point that Matthew's trying to make, which is that Jesus is Yahweh. We can't miss that reading the New Testament. We can't miss that authority of Jesus, the connection to the Old Testament, an obvious connection for Matthew that Jesus is God. I love it. I hope you do too, because this teaching that's given right through Matthew 5 to 7 is a way of showing Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is God himself, and Jesus has given these Beatitudes in order for us to show that this New Testament law of Jesus exceeds the Old Testament law, And it's one that not only comes through with the Beatitudes, that's number one, but also comes through here in chapter 5 with a set of 6 antitheses. Man, I always mess up that word. Antithesis. It's almost like a sneeze. But anyway, there are 6 of them. 6 antithesis. Sorry. Let's just pretend I spelled that right and not had to correct it on the go. There are 6 of them. And so these 6 antitheses are the teaching about anger, starting in verse 21, teaching about adultery, verse 27, a paragraph about teaching on divorce, that's 31, teaching about vows, verse 33, a paragraph on teaching about revenge, 38, and finally a teaching about love for enemies, 43. And what we see in those teachings is this exceeding of the law of the Old Testament. For example, in the first one, teaching about anger, Jesus says, "You have heard it said, or you have heard that our ancestors were told, you must not murder." 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder. If you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. But I say, who does Jesus think he is? He knows he is the Messiah. He knows he is God. But I say, if you're even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. And if you have hatred in your heart, well, this is a way then for us to see that in the Old Testament, you heard it said that you would be blessed if you keep the commandment, right? So do not murder. But Jesus is exceeding this by saying, thou shalt not hate. Well, this, remember, is all about exceeding. Exceed the Old Testament law. Now, all of this, if we can come back up here, all of this is going to make sense for those who are first hearing this from Matthew and those who are experiencing this at the time. And I think for us as well, as we look at the covenant that goes with each of these givings of the law. So the covenant that's given in the Old Testament on Mount Sinai after the giving of the law is a covenant that says, if you keep my commands, so if you're following these, if you keep my commands, then I will make you into a nation of priests and a holy nation. So that is given in Exodus, and that covenant comes through in Exodus 19 and 20. And we know that moving forward from that, that if you keep this, you will be blessed by coming into the land. Now we're going to see how important this land is to the kingdom of heaven in this third aspect now happening here in chapter 5. So you will in fact come into the land if you keep the commandments. That's the covenant that is going on here in Exodus. Well, when we look into the New Testament, what we see is that there is a new covenant that is given. That was terrible. Can't fit that in there, but it says covenant. The new covenant that's given. The old covenant was to keep these commands. The new covenant is still very much about keeping the commands and teachings that even exceed the Old Testament teachings. But here is the difference. The difference is that we know from the Old Testament, and even Moses knew that this was going to happen in Deuteronomy 31, in order to keep this blessing of the land that comes, they would need to remain holy. But we see in the New Testament that the new covenant is all about Jesus. The new covenant comes in the person and work of Jesus. The person and work because his person is in fact the God-man, and his work is very much in fact the cross and the empty tomb. And so we see that, I was going to use green, The difference is that the one who is holy is Jesus. And so the connection here is that the people were exiled from the land for not being holy. But Jesus is in fact the Holy One. And so he is the one that God is drawing all of his people to. He is this new location. He is the one that God is drawing into himself, drawing unto himself. Come and follow me. And so this fulfillment of the promise of drawing the people of God back into his kingdom is actually fulfilled in the person of Jesus as he draws people unto himself. So Jesus is the one who is able to accomplish the law of the Old Testament. Not a piece of it will fade away. And in fact, even as is exceeded by the Sermon on the Mount, even as it has this raising up of that, Jesus is the one who completes it. Well, we see in Jeremiah 31 that the prophet is looking forward to this new covenant time. In Jeremiah 31, you can read this, the new covenant is already prophesied about, and how God would bring a new covenant to Israel, and that this new covenant would be fulfilled by God himself. And this new covenant is fulfilled in Jesus. And we see this happening in Hebrews 7 and 8. We see how Jesus is in fact the one who brings the new covenant, brought to us by his body and by his blood. And it's brought to us by God himself being the one who fulfills it. And there are three ways in which this new covenant is brought to God's people. First is the forgiveness of sin. The second is by giving us the Holy Spirit. And the third is by, I'm thinking right now, the third is by this law being written on our head, in our heads, in our minds, and in our hearts. That's what happens in Jeremiah 31, a fulfillment of God's promise to do this new covenant work through Jesus himself is how this is completed. So there's a lot that's going on here in the Sermon on the Mount, and there's definitely a lot that's going on in chapter 5, and I hope that this connection between the teachings of Jesus on the Mount and the teachings of Moses on Mount Sinai has been a blessing to you.